Imagine a multi-trillion-dollar military force. We were talking about the absolute pinnacle of human engineering here.
Right, the most advanced stealth fighter jets ever built.
Exactly. Precision munitions that can, like, drop down a chimney from 40,000 feet. Just absolute uncontested dominance of the sky.
It is a terrifying amount of power.
It really is. But now I want you to imagine all of that technological supremacy rendered completely powerless.
By rocks.
Yeah, by solid granite. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are looking at a geopolitical scenario that just completely upends the traditional rules of warfare.
It really throws the whole playbook out the window.
Totally. We are analyzing a highly detailed, hypothetical retrospective document today. It is a text titled Barak Face, 30 Days of Operation Epic Fury, by an author named Paramendra Kumar Bhagat.
And the date on this document is key. It's dated March 29, 2026.
Right, 2026.
So that specific date is the lens we have to look through today. This is a projected scenario. It is a detailed war game of a massive conflict occurring in the near future between the United States and Israel on one side and Iran on the other.
And before we get into the heavy mechanics of this, and trust me, we are going to get into the absolute weeds of the military doctrine, the subterranean engineering, and, well, the global economics.
Oh yeah, the economics are wild.
They really are. But I want to establish a very strict baseline for you, the listener, right up front. This deep dive is an entirely impartial exploration of the strategic analysis presented in this specific document.
Right, we are just looking at the text.
Exactly. We are not taking any political sides here. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author or the nations involved or, advocating for any specific foreign policy.
No, not at all. Our mission today is purely analytical.
Purely analytical. We're going to break down the fascinating and honestly kind of terrifying mechanics of modern asymmetric warfare as the author envisions them.
Because we want to understand how a conflict like this actually functions on a mechanical level.
Yeah.
We're essentially reverse engineering the author's logic here.
Yeah, taking it apart piece by piece.
Exactly. The text presents a highly specific environment where two fundamentally incompatible ways of fighting just collide head-on.
And the core of that collision is this profound paradox that becomes really apparent by day 30 of this hypothetical timeline.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this paradox is what hooked me immediately.
It is the central mystery of the whole piece.
Right. According to the author, by the 30-day mark, Iran has lost its skies completely. The coalition has achieved total air supremacy.
Complete control.
And Iran has suffered a devastating decapitation strike against its highest leadership on day one. Plus, they have absorbed over 11,000 bomb strikes across their territory.
11,000. That is a staggering number.
It is. And yet, despite taking what looks like a catastrophic beating on paper, they were somehow managing to hold the entire global economy hostage. How is that even possible? Well, because you are actually watching two completely different stories playing out simultaneously in the same war.
Two stories. Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. Story number one is the conventional, highly visible narrative. This is the U.S. and Israeli coalition systematically dismantling Iran's surface-level military infrastructure from the sky.
Right, the stuff you can see on a satellite map.
Exactly. If you are measuring the success of the campaign by, destroyed radar arrays, flattened surface factories, and sunken naval vessels, the coalition is achieving overwhelming textbook dominance.
But then there is story number two.
Right. Story number two is happening beneath the surface, literally and metaphorically.
This is the story of Iran surviving underground. They are preserving their most lethal retaliatory capabilities and using highly asymmetric tactics to slowly strangle the global economy.
Because the author's fundamental thesis is that Iran's strategy was never to win a symmetrical military exchange in the sky. They knew they couldn't do that.
Right, you don't send a 1970s jet against an F-35.
Exactly. Their strategy is to outlast the coalition's patience, bleeding them not just on the battlefield, but in the global financial markets.
So to understand how those two stories intersect, we have to look at the opening moments of the timeline the author lays out. February 28, 2026.
Day one.
Day one. The text refers to the opening coalition move as a meteor shower.
Which is a very poetic way to describe something absolutely devastating.
It really is. It is a massive, synchronized opening salvo. The text details over 100 U.S. and Israeli aircraft penetrating Iranian airspace.
We are talking about Israeli F-35 stealth fighters executing sea aid missions.
Sea. That stands for suppression of enemy air defenses, right?
Yes, exactly. Basically blinding the radar network so that the big heavy bombers like the B-1 Lancer and the B-52 Stratofortress can safely enter the theater.
And they are supplemented by massive waves of Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from naval assets in the region.
Right, and they strike over 1,000 targets almost simultaneously.
1,000 targets in one go. That is insane.
Well, in modern military doctrine, an opening strike of that magnitude is usually designed to induce systemic paralysis.
Paralysis, like shock and awe.
Exactly. You sever the communication lines, you destroy the command and control nodes, and you disrupt the adversary's O-Day loop.
The O-Day loop, that's observe, orient, decide, and act. Right.
Got it. You want to make it physically and psychologically impossible for them to coordinate a coherent response.
But the author emphasizes that this specific strike goes beyond just paralysis. It is designed as a decapitation strike.
Which is a crucial distinction.
Because the defining shockwave of day one in this scenario is the reported death of the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei.
Along with a significant portion of the senior Iranian leadership.
Right. They didn't just target the nervous system of the country, they targeted the brain.
The intention being that by removing the ideological and operational head of the state, the broader command structure would just collapse into infighting or confusion.
Before the military could mount any sort of retaliation.
Right, that was the hope. But the retaliation happens immediately.
Instantly. The text outlines Iran's countermove, which they dub Operation True Promise the Few.
And they don't try to send their aging sleet of fighter jets up to dogfight with fifth-generation F-35s, like you said earlier.
No, that would be suicide. Instead, they launch hundreds of Shahed drones and ballistic missiles toward Israel and U.S. bases across the Gulf.
And that immediate shift to unmanned, mass-produced systems perfectly illustrates the asymmetry at play here.
Right. Let's talk about those drones, the Shahed 136, for instance.
Yeah, the Shahed is essentially a slow-moving delta-wing loitering munition. It is basically a flying lawnmower.
A flying lawnmower packed with explosives.
Exactly. And the key is that it is incredibly cheap to produce. We are talking often estimated around $20,000 to $50,000 per unit.
Which is nothing in military terms.
Pennies. The tactical advantage isn't speed or stealth, it is mass.
Right, you just overwhelm them.
When you launch hundreds of them simultaneously, you are intentionally trying to saturate the targeting cues of advanced air defense systems.
Like the Iron Dome or Patriot batteries?
Yes. You force the opponent into a terrible mathematical corner.
Because they have to fire a $2 million advanced interceptor missile to shoot down a $20,000 drone with a moped engine.
Simply because if they don't, that cheap drone hits a critical power plant or a barracks.
The math is just brutal.
A cost-exchange ratio heavily favors the attacker in that scenario.
It's economics as much as it is ballistics. But the kinetic strikes are only half of the day one response, right?
Exactly. The text highlights a massive escalation in the cyber domain.
The author notes that alongside the physical projectiles, Iran launches major cyber attacks that trigger widespread disruptions across coalition infrastructure.
And simultaneously, Iranian domestic infrastructure suffers a massive 60-hour blackout.
A 60-hour total grid failure. I mean, we really have to pause on the mechanics of that.
It's hard to even picture.
It is. Because turning off a country's power grid isn't like, flipping a giant breaker switch on a wall.
No, it implies deep, deep penetration into SCADA systems.
Right, the supervisory control and data acquisition networks, the computers that physically manage power plants, water flow, and industrial facilities.
The text suggests a level of cyber warfare where both sides are successfully bricking the foundational infrastructure of the other.
It creates this fog of war that extends right into the civilian sector immediately. People waking up with no power, no water.
And as the timeline moves into days 2 through 7, that initial shock gives way to a brutal expansion of the target lists.
Right, things escalate quickly. The coalition starts hunting deeper into the strategic spine of the country.
The text mentions strikes on the Natanz underground nuclear sites, deep missile manufacturing facilities, and the systematic destruction of Iranian frigates.
They are just clearing the board. But this is also the window where the coalition starts taking its first real casualties.
Yes, the retaliation starts landing.
The text specifically highlights a deadly drone strike in Kuwait that reportedly kills 6 Americans.
And it also notes that despite the overlapping layers of highly advanced interception systems, Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow 3 Israel, begins absorbing ballistic missile impacts in major urban zones.
The saturation tactics we talked about, they start working. Some of them get through.
They always do. Which brings us back to the decapitation strike.
Right. The coalition took out the supreme leader on day one. They shattered the top tier of the command structure.
So why are the missiles still flying?
Exactly. This is where I really struggle with the psychological logic of this scenario. Let me throw an analogy at you.
Okay, let's hear it.
If we look at this through the lens of a boxing match, right? The bell rings, one fighter leaps across the ring, instantly knocks out the opponent's trainer, breaks the opponent's jaw, and fractures both their arms.
Ouch.
Right.
Wow.
In a conventional sense, the fight is over. The opponent cannot function.
They should be on the mat.
Exactly. But in this scenario, the guy with the broken arms just ignores the pain and starts viciously kicking the structural pillars of the arena, trying to bring the entire roof down on the crowd.
That is quite the image.
But it fits, right? If you execute a successful decapitation strike, why doesn't the command structure fundamentally collapse? Why doesn't the military paralyze?
Because the assumption that decapitation equals capitulation is heavily rooted in conventional Western military thinking.
Where hierarchies are very rigid and top-down, general to colonel private.
Right. But the author points out that in a highly ideological revolutionary system like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the removal of the top tier does not create a vacuum of surrender.
It creates a vacuum of power.
Exactly. And that vacuum is instantly filled by the next tier down. The IRGC is intentionally structured in a cellular, highly decentralized manner, specifically to survive the loss of its central nervous system.
Oh, wow. So the local commanders already have their standing orders. They don't need Tehran to pick up the phone and tell them to launch the missiles. The authority is already delegated.
Exactly that. Furthermore, the psychological impact is the complete opposite of what a conventional strategist might hope for.
How so?
Well, the author uses a very specific, chilling word to describe the aftermath of the decapitation strike. Purification.
Purification? Geez. That implies getting rid of something unwanted.
Right. In the context of the regime, the older, top-tier leaders who were killed in the opening strike were the ones who actually had to balance ideology with pragmatism.
Because they were running a country.
Exactly. They were the ones managing the economy, dealing with diplomatic back channels, worrying about sanctions.
So they had a reason to hold back.
Yes. So by eliminating them, the coalition didn't open the door for some moderate democratic uprising. They effectively removed the cautious elders.
And handed the keys to the entire military apparatus directly to a younger, infinitely more radicalized, hardened cadre of commanders.
Commanders who have absolutely zero interest in pragmatism.
So by trying to cut off the head of the snake, they essentially just mutated it into something far more aggressive and cornered.
That is exactly what the text argues.
Which explains the rapid transition we see in the text around day 8. The Iranian leadership stabilizes, not with a moderate, but with Mojtaba Khamenei being elevated to supreme leader.
The hardline succession is completely cemented.
And what's fascinating here is that this new leadership immediately realizes a stark mathematical truth. They cannot win a conventional war in the sky against the F-35.
No, they are bleeding surface assets by the hour.
Right, so they execute their most dangerous strategic pivot. They shift the center of gravity of the entire conflict away from the land and directly into the sea.
They deploy their ultimate asymmetric trump card.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, the Strait of Hormuz.
The text details a systematic campaign of maritime sabotage and mining, resulting in over 20 tanker incidents in a very short window.
20 incidents. That is enough to make the shipping industry completely panic.
Oh, absolutely. Shipping traffic grinds to a near-total halt. And the immediate visceral consequence of that is Brent crude oil spiking above $120 a barrel.
And we really have to unpack the tactical difficulty of what is happening here. When people hear mining a strait, they might picture like old, floating, spiky iron spheres from World War II.
Right, the kind you see in old submarine movies.
Exactly. But modern naval mine warfare is incredibly sophisticated. We're talking about bottom-tethered smart mines that just sit quietly on the seabed.
They don't detonate on contact, do they?
No, they don't. They are programmed to listen for the specific acoustic signature or detect the massive magnetic anomaly of a commercial supertanker or a military vessel passing overhead.
Wow, and clearing those smart mines has to be a nightmare.
It is arguably one of the most dangerous jobs in the Navy.
I mean, for you listening who follow naval strategy, you know that the U.S. Navy's primary minesweepers, the Avenger-class ships, are aging.
They are very old.
They are slow, and they literally have fiberglass or wooden hulls to avoid triggering those magnetic mines.
Which is great for not blowing up the mine, but it makes them incredibly fragile.
Right. So if you send a slow-moving wooden minesweeper into the narrow waters of the Strait of Hormuz to meticulously hunt for bottom mines, that ship becomes an absolute sitting duck.
A sitting duck for Iranian coastal anti-ship cruise missiles hidden in the mountains overlooking the water.
So you cannot clear the water until you secure the coast.
And you cannot secure the coast because the terrain is too mountainous and heavily fortified. It is a complete tactical deadlock.
And the global economic shockwaves are instantaneous. I mean, think about it. The Strait of Hormuz handles roughly a fifth of the world's global oil supply.
And a massive percentage of liquefied natural gas, too.
So when tankers start hitting mines, the Lloyd's of London Joint War Committee designates the area a high-risk zone. Marine insurance premiums skyrocket overnight.
Which means the cost of simply putting a ship in the water becomes financially ruinous for energy companies.
They have to reroute shipments all the way around the Cape of Good Hope. That adds weeks to transit times, burns more fuel, and creates a massive tonnage bottleneck in the global supply chain.
This isn't just a military maneuver to tie up the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet.
No, this is deliberate global economic hostage-taking. I want you to think about your own gas pump and your grocery bills. When oil spikes past $120 a barrel, that causes immediate crippling inflation.
It hits the United States and Europe hard, sure, but it absolutely devastates the emerging economies in the global south.
Right, places like India, Pakistan, and vast parts of Africa, they rely on that energy flow just to keep their electrical grids functioning and their food transported.
Iran is essentially broadcasting a brutal message to the international community.
What's the message?
If our domestic economy is going to zero under the weight of your bunker busters, we possess the geographic leverage to drag the entire global economy down to zero alongside us.
Dragging everyone down with them. And while this global economic crisis is unfolding in the Strait, the physical war on the mainland goes through a very distinct tactical evolution.
Because the coalition is relentlessly pounding Iranian infrastructure.
Right. The South Pars gas fields are hit. The Arak heavy water facilities are bombed. And the text notes that, in response, Iran's massive missile salvos, the waves of hundreds of projectiles we saw on day one shrink dramatically.
They drop down to concentrated bursts of maybe 9 to 30 missiles at a time.
Now, a conventional military analyst looking at that data point might conclude that the bombing campaign is succeeding.
Yeah. They might think, oh, they're running out of missiles, their logistics are collapsing, the end is near.
But the author argues that this is absolutely not a sign of surrender.
Not at all. It is a deliberate pivot to guerrilla warfare.
Let me use another analogy. It's like starting a fight against a massive organized army standing in an open field. You drop a bomb on them, but instead of dying, they shatter into a million stinging wasps.
I like that. The wasp analogy.
Right. They aren't trying to overwhelm the coalition with one massive knockout punch anymore. They are conserving their energy, stinging just enough over and over simply to prove that they are still alive.
Still functioning and still capable of inflicting pain.
Exactly. But how do they do that?
Well, the mechanics of that WASP strategy are deeply tied to the threat of orbital detection.
Satellites.
Yes. Firing a coordinated wave of 100 ballistic missiles requires a massive logistical footprint. You have to move dozens of massive transporter erector launchers TELs out into the open.
And those things are huge.
They are. You have huge communication signatures that can be intercepted by signals intelligence. And most importantly, the launch of a ballistic missile generates a massive thermal bloom.
Like a giant pillar of fire.
It is a giant infrared flare going off on the surface of the Earth. And that is instantly detected by U.S. Space Force early warning satellites.
So by dropping the salvo size down to 9 or 15 missiles, they require a fraction of that exposure.
Right. They are minimizing their detectable preparation signatures. They launch, and then they hide before the satellite revisit times allow the coalition to generate target coordinates for a retaliatory strike.
It transforms the conflict from a war of overwhelming force into a war of attrition, just bleeding the enemy slowly.
But that tactic only works if you have somewhere completely invulnerable to hide those launchers between strikes.
Right, because you cannot hide a 50-foot ballistic missile on the back of a heavy truck in a forest canopy. It just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because this leads us to the most fascinating and, frankly, the most terrifying section of the author's analysis.
Subterranean stuff.
Exactly. The multi-trillion-dollar question is, how do these wasps survive? The U.S. and Israel have total dominance of the sky.
Total.
They have this closed club in the sky. F-35Is, B-1s, B-52s. They possess the most advanced synthetic aperture radar satellites that can literally see through clouds.
They have relentless drone surveillance.
And they drop the smartest precision munitions ever designed. How does a massive industrial-scale missile force survive 30 days of relentless, uncontested bombing?
The answer lies entirely beneath the earth.
The text shifts focus to Iran's missile cities, and the author really stresses that we have to completely abandon our conventional vocabulary when discussing them.
Because when we hear underground facilities, the mind naturally conjures images of caves or reinforced concrete bunkers or maybe transit tunnels.
Yeah, like old World War II documentaries showing concrete pillboxes.
But that is precisely the wrong image. Tunnels are thoroughfares designed to get you from point A to point B. What Iran has engineered, according to the text, are industrial-scale subterranean fortresses.
Fortresses.
And the psychology driving this engineering marvel is crucial to understand. This underground network isn't a hasty reaction to the threat of F-35s in 2026.
No, it's been going on for a long time.
This is the culmination of decades of national paranoia born during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s.
When Saddam Hussein was raining Scud missiles down on Iranian cities, the War of the Cities.
Exactly. The traumatic foundational lesson Tehran internalized in the 1980s was absolute.
Yeah.
If you fight on the surface, you die on the surface. Air superiority will always eventually crush surface forces.
So what did they do?
Therefore, for over 40 years, they have dedicated immense national wealth and engineering resources to burying their most critical military infrastructure.
And the depth the text describes is almost incomprehensible. We're talking about facilities bored 500 meters deep into mountainous granite.
500 meters.
Let's put that in perspective for you, because the number alone doesn't really do it justice.
Okay.
That is over 1,640 feet. That is deeper than the Empire State Building is tall.
It's massive.
They have essentially built inverted skyscrapers straight down into the bedrock of the Zagros Mountains. And the author specifically contrasts this geological reality with the ultimate weapon the U.S. military possesses for this exact problem.
The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator.
The MOP.
Commonly known as the MOP, yes. The undisputed king of the bunker busters.
Right. It is a 30,000-pound precision-guided bomb.
It is so massive, it can only be carried by the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber or the B-52.
And how does it work?
Well, it uses a GPS-aided inertial navigation system to hit a precise coordinate, and it relies on sheer kinetic energy falling from altitude and a specialized hardened steel casing to literally punch its way through the Earth.
Like a massive dart.
Exactly, before a delayed action fuse detonates the explosive payload deep underground.
But the text outlines a terrifying physics problem for the coalition.
A huge problem.
Under ideal conditions, dropping precisely on target, the MOP can penetrate roughly 60 meters of reinforced concrete and moderately packed earth.
60 meters of maximum penetration capacity against an infrastructure that is buried under 500 meters of solid, dense granite.
It is a mathematical impossibility. The most powerful non-nuclear bomb in the human arsenal essentially just scratches the paint. The blast wave cannot travel through that much solid rock.
This is why the author explicitly states that the mountains themselves are acting as literal armor.
It's not just a bunker.
No, Iran hasn't just built bunkers. They have integrated their strategic military capability into the geology of the planet itself. You cannot bomb away a mountain range.
And the scale inside these facilities is mind-bending. The text describes an entire subterranean ecosystem. We are not talking about cramped, claustrophobic shafts.
Oh, we are talking about bored corridors that are 6 to 10 meters wide.
They have excavated caverns with ceilings up to 15 meters high. Why do they need them that high?
Well, you need a 15-meter ceiling so that you can erect a medium-range ballistic missile to a completely vertical firing position indoors.
Oh, wow.
Yes, you run all your diagnostic checks and fuel it with highly volatile liquid propellants in a completely controlled, climate-regulated environment before it ever even sees the sky.
That's incredible. They have internal high-speed rail systems to move massive warheads and TELs miles across the complex without ever exposing them to daylight.
They have independent subterranean power hubs, massive ventilation systems with scrubbers to handle the toxic exhaust of missile launches.
Because otherwise they'd suffocate.
Right. They have living quarters and command centers.
The text names specific geographical hubs for these fortresses, too. Khorramabad in the Lorestan province, the Kanesh Canyon, the deep granite complexes in Yazd, and an entire interconnected network spanning the southern coast near the Persian Gulf.
Looking right out over the Strait of Hormuz.
It is an entire metro system explicitly designed for modern warfare, and it is engineered with a specific architectural philosophy that neutralizes the advantage of coalition satellite surveillance and smart bombs.
The author calls it the Hydra
A
design.
Hydra design, which answers the immediate logical pushback anyone would have.
Right.
When I first read about these massive underground cities, my first thought was, okay, maybe we can't blow up the mountain itself, but a facility that massive has to have doors, right?
It has to.
The missiles have to come out to the surface eventually to be fired. So if we know where these bases are, and if the coalition has satellites staring at every inch of the country, why can't a B-1 bomber just loiter high above, wait for the massive blast doors to open, and drop a precision munition right down the throat of the entrance? Just seal them inside their own fortress?
It's a fair question. And in a linear system, that tactic works perfectly.
But this isn't linear.
No. The text explains the principle of extreme dispersion. These complexes do not have a single, massive, vulnerable gateway.
That would be too easy.
Exactly. The Hydra design means they possess dozens, sometimes hundreds, of highly dispersed, heavily disguised entrances.
Wow. Hundreds.
Some are engineered to look like natural rock faces that slide away. Some are disguised as civilian agricultural warehouses or industrial depots.
And some are fake, right?
Yes, many are just false portals, heavily reinforced concrete dummies, designed specifically to draw million-dollar coalition bombs away from the real exits.
So it becomes the world's deadliest, most expensive game of subterranean whack-a-mole. You manage to identify and bomb one door. You collapse the tunnel entrance.
But the Iranian commanders inside don't care.
Because the internal rail system simply shifts the missile platform 3 miles down the tunnel network to a completely different door disguised as a goat farm, and they launch from there 10 minutes later.
Furthermore, the text details a brilliant, if chilling, defensive engineering tactic.
What's that?
Well, Iran anticipates that coalition forces will eventually find and bomb the real doors. So they preemptively backfill certain unused entrances with thousands of tons of concrete.
Creating what the author calls a concrete sarcophagus.
Exactly.
The physics behind that are fascinating.
You really are.
When a bunker buster hits, the explosion follows the path of least resistance. If you have an open tunnel, the blast overpressure rushes down the corridor, destroying everything inside.
It's basically a massive pressure cooker.
Right. But if you have intentionally plugged the entrance with a massive concrete sarcophagus, the bunker buster hits that dense plug, and the kinetic energy of the explosion is forced to expand horizontally or back outwards into the air.
Which completely shields the delicate internal rail systems and personnel deeper inside the mountain.
They are literally weaponizing concrete to blunt the overpressure. It's genius.
It is. And this leads the author to tackle a historical comparison that is frequently and dangerously misapplied.
Okay, let's hear it.
Whenever Western military planners discuss fighting an entrenched enemy in a tunnel network, the immediate historical touchstone is the Vietnam War.
Right, specifically the Cu Chi tunnels.
Exactly.
The idea of having to send infantry tunnel rats down into the dark to clear the enemy out inch by inch.
But the text vehemently argues that comparing Iran's missile cities to Vietnam is a fundamental and fatal underestimation.
Yeah, the author sharply contrasts the two realities.
The Cu Chi tunnels were undoubtedly impressive feats of human endurance and guerrilla engineering, but they were generally 3 to 10 meters deep.
Right, very shallow.
And they were hand-dug out of soft clay using shovels and baskets. And their primary tactical purpose was to hide lightly armed infantry from American foot patrols, dogs, and artillery fire.
You are hiding guys with AK-47s who pop out of spider holes.
Precisely. But Iran's underground facilities are hundreds of meters deep. They were not dug by hand. They were bored into solid granite over decades using massive, imported industrial tunnel boring machines.
The same technology used to dig the tunnel under the English Channel.
Yes. And their purpose is not to hide infantry. It is to hide, maintain, and launch an industrial, strategic ballistic missile force, capable of striking targets 1,000 miles away.
The synthesis the author arrives at here is staggering. If the sheer frustration of the aerial stalemate forced the U.S. or Israel into a ground invasion to physically clear these fortresses out, it wouldn't just be Vietnam 2.0.
No, it'd be a nightmare.
It would be Vietnam upgraded with 21st century sensors, hypersonics, and a fully functioning nationwide underground grid backing the defenders.
It is a strategic nightmare that guarantees catastrophic casualties for an invading force.
Which is exactly why the coalition doctrine dictates fighting from the sky. They refuse to get drawn into the granite.
But even fighting from the sky, relying on air superiority, Iran has a massive advantage that deeply complicates the coalition's dominance.
Right. Speaking of 21st century upgrades, Iran isn't fighting this subterranean war completely blind.
No, they aren't.
And that brings us to the Shadow War and the grinding stalemate, covering days 22 through 30 of the timeline. Because even if you possess the deepest, most impenetrable subterranean fortress in human history, a ballistic missile is entirely useless if you don't know where to aim it.
Exactly.
If the coalition systematically destroyed 85% of Iran's radar arrays, air defense sensors, and communication nodes in the first week, Iran should be fighting completely blind.
They should be.
They shouldn't be able to hit a specific airbase in Israel or a moving ship in the Gulf. But they are. They have eyes in the sky. It's just that the eyes don't belong to them.
This is where the text identifies a profound shift in the architecture of modern global conflict. The author details the indirect, yet massive and critical interference of great powers.
Specifically Russia and China.
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it changes everything.
The text outlines the specific assets being quietly, relentlessly funneled to Tehran.
Russia is utilizing its orbital constellation to provide high-resolution imaging satellites and real-time targeting support.
And China goes even further.
Oh, much further. They are providing access to their Jilin-1 commercial imaging constellation.
The Jilin-1 satellites, they are incredibly capable, right?
Very. They use optical and synthetic aperture radar, meaning they can see through cloud cover and smoke to map the battlefield.
Wow.
Furthermore, China is providing targeting and navigation support through their Beidou system.
Which is essentially the Chinese equivalent of GPS, but highly resistant to American spoofing or jamming.
Exactly. And on top of all that, they are feeding Iranian commanders signals intelligence and electronic warfare support.
So if we step back and look at the macro level, this redefines the concept of World War III.
It really does. We aren't seeing Russian tank battalions rolling across borders or Chinese stealth fighters dogfighting with American F-35s.
No, but they are actively, decisively fighting a proxy war in the data domain.
By feeding real-time situational awareness directly into the bloodstream of a regional conflict, they are giving Iran the precise targeting telemetry necessary to ensure that those concentrated bursts of 9 to 30 missiles actually bypass the Iron Dome and hit something strategically valuable.
They are completely outsourcing their intelligence apparatus. But this brings up a massive geopolitical question.
I think I know what you're going to ask.
Why would Beijing or Moscow risk the fury of the United States potentially triggering massive secondary sanctions or even a direct naval confrontation just to help Iran aim a few dozen missiles? It seems like a massive strategic overreach for a regional conflict.
Well, from the perspective of Moscow and Beijing, the risk is actually minimal, and the strategic reward is astronomical.
How so?
The beauty of proxy warfare in the data domain is plausible deniability.
Ah. It's a commercial satellite company.
Exactly. Or, we cannot control who accesses our open-source navigation signals. They never fire a single shot, but they are successfully bleeding American military resources.
They are testing the limitations of American anti-missile systems like the Patriot and Techad in real-time combat conditions.
Yes, and degrading the economic power of the West, all while Iranian forces take all the physical kinetic risk.
It's the ultimate asymmetric leverage. But, okay, let me play devil's advocate here. Even with Chinese satellites guiding them, the mechanics of launching the missiles still expose the Iranians, right? If I am a U.S. Space Force commander staring at a satellite feed, and my early warning satellite picks up the massive, undeniable heat bloom of an Iranian solid-fuel ballistic missile launching out of a disguised mountain door, why can't I just vaporize the launcher?
It seems like you should be able to.
Right. Even with Chinese GPS, the launch itself is a massive flare going off. We know exactly where the door is now. Why not just blow it up?
The author addresses this exact operational frustration, and it ties directly back to the subterranean infrastructure we were just talking about. It is what military planners call the rapid exit architecture.
Rapid exit?
Yes. The transporter erector launchers, the TLs, are completely mobile, and the entire launch sequence is choreographed to exploit the latency, the time delay, and the coalition's kill chain.
The kill chain. Meaning the time it takes for the satellite to see the launch, transmit the coordinates to a command center, assign a drone or an F-15 to the target, and for that aircraft to drop a bomb.
Exactly. Every step takes time. So the TATL sits deep underground, completely protected. It is fully fueled, and the Chinese targeting data is already loaded into the missile's computer.
Ready to go.
The disguised mountain door slides open. The TATL drives out onto the surface. It immediately erects the missile, fires it, lowers the boom, and reverses back into the mountain tunnel.
Wow.
The door slides shut. The entire duration of surface exposure from seeing daylight to vanishing back into the granite might be measured in less than 3 minutes.
3 minutes. It is literally like a shark fin breaking the surface of the water, striking the target, and instantly vanishing back into the deep.
By the time the U.S. satellite registers the infrared launch bloom, processes the exact coordinate geometry, and a loitering drone or F-35 gets a weapon on target, the launcher isn't just gone.
It is already 100 meters deep under solid rock, moving on a rail line to a completely different sector.
It is the absolute perfection of the shoot-and-scoot tactic, enabled by underground invulnerability.
And this dynamic, the coalition bombing the surface into dust, while Iran shoots from the depths and hides, creates a grinding, horrific stalemate.
It's a war of attrition at its absolute worst.
By day 30, the text lays out the grim, unyielding statistics of this reality. And the numbers are staggering. They really highlight the human toll of the grind.
Let's look at those numbers.
By the 30-day mark, the text states the coalition has hit over 11,000 targets across Iranian territory. They've destroyed roughly 140 Iranian naval vessels, essentially rendering the conventional surface Navy combat ineffective.
But the cost in blood is severe.
Very severe. In Iran, the text estimates between 2,000 and 7,000 dead, including 1,500 to 3,200 civilians caught in the blast radiuses of infrastructure strikes.
And Israel.
Israel has suffered roughly 19 killed and over 5,000 injured, mostly from the sheer volume of interceptor debris raining down on urban areas and the psychological trauma of constant sirens.
And the U.S.
The U.S. has seen roughly 13 service members killed in drone strikes on regional bases, with hundreds more injured.
Military planners often measure war in maps, in the tonnage of ordnance dropped or the tactical elegance of a multi-domain strike package. But the text rightly insists that the true scoreboard is bodies.
The true scoreboard is bodies.
And beyond the fatalities, there is the catastrophic societal cost. Millions of people internally displaced, electrical grids shattered, water purification offline.
It is the grim, brutal logic of a medieval siege, applied with 21st century hypersonic weaponry. The coalition doctrine is basically to punish the population and the civil infrastructure until the leadership breaks.
But as we've established, the leadership, the newly purified, highly radicalized cadres secure in their 500-meter deep granite bunkers, isn't breaking.
The pain on the surface is acceptable to them.
Which brings us to a terrifying precipice at the 1-month mark.
Right. We have a military reality locked in an unbreakable subterranean and aerial stalemate. We have a global economy hemorrhaging billions of dollars a day because the Strait of Hormuz is choked with smart mines.
The vital question becomes, how do the leaders involved possibly find a way out? How does this end?
Exactly. The author dedicates the final portion of the analysis to mapping out 3 very distinct, competing strategic visions for the endgame.
Right. Let's start by looking at the theoretical endgame of Donald Trump, who is referenced in the text analysis of U.S. strategic postures during this 2026 scenario.
His approach is characterized by the phrase, shock, strike, deal.
The philosophy is straightforward. Apply overwhelming, apocalyptic levels of kinetic force on day 1. To fundamentally break the opponent's will, shatter their military capacity, and then immediately force them to the negotiating table from a position of absolute, humiliating weakness.
You dictate the terms of the deal because they have no leverage left.
But the text notes the fatal flaw in this plan when applied to an asymmetric underground adversary.
Right, the war is dragging on. Iran isn't breaking.
And as the conflict drags past 30 days, it threatens domestic American priorities. Gas prices are skyrocketing, inflation is surging, and political credibility is waning.
The deal part of the strategy becomes impossible if the shock part fails to induce surrender. You are just left with an expensive, deeply unpopular war.
Then you have the Israeli perspective, epitomized by Benjamin Netanyahu's endgame. The author describes this doctrine as permanent degradation.
Permanent degradation, so never stopping.
From the Israeli strategic viewpoint, Iran's missile and nuclear capabilities are not just a geopolitical nuisance. They are an existential threat to the survival of the state.
Therefore, there is no acceptable diplomatic deal that leaves those subterranean capabilities intact.
Exactly. The goal isn't to sign a treaty. The goal is to continuously, relentlessly bomb the infrastructure, assassinate the scientists, and sabotage the supply chains to keep the threat suppressed indefinitely.
It is a forever war by design.
But the author points out the profound limitation of that strategy. You can bomb a centrifuge factory, you can crater a runway, but you cannot bomb an ideology.
Especially when that ideology is heavily fortified beneath mountains and constantly resupplied with data and components by sympathetic great powers like China and Russia.
It requires an infinite expenditure of million-dollar munitions to suppress cheap drones. It's unsustainable.
And that brings us to Iran's endgame, which is arguably the simplest to understand and therefore the most incredibly resilient.
For Iran, survival equals victory.
Survival equals victory. It is the ultimate asymmetric mindset. They don't need to march their infantry into Jerusalem or Washington, D.C. to win.
No. If the regime is still breathing, still in control of the state apparatus, and still capable of launching a single ballistic missile out of a mountain door on day 31, they win.
They have successfully defied the combined multi-trillion-dollar might of the U.S. and Israel and survived. That alone grants them massive ideological legitimacy across the region.
So we have three endgames that are completely, fundamentally incompatible. Total surrender, permanent bombing, or stubborn survival.
So what does this all mean? The author realizes that an American ground invasion to physically dig them out is politically and militarily fatal. It would just be an unprecedented bloodbath.
Right. So diplomacy isn't just some idealistic hope whispered by think tanks. Diplomacy becomes the only mathematically viable strategy left on the table to stop the economic bleeding.
The text outlines a proposed framework for an off-ramp. It's complex, it requires bitter pills for everyone involved, but it is necessary.
What does it look like?
It involves Iran agreeing to freeze its military nuclear capacity and submit to severe inspections in exchange for a phased relief of the crushing economic sanctions.
Okay.
It requires the immediate, verifiable demining and reopening of the Strait of Hormuz to save the global markets. And crucially, it involves the third party. In this case, the text suggests Russia stepping in to supply civilian nuclear fuel.
Allowing Iran to save face domestically on its claims to a civilian nuclear energy program while verifiably neutralizing the weapons threat.
Exactly. But the author goes a step further than just listing the dry bullet points of a theoretical treaty. They dive deeply into the psychology of modern diplomacy.
They propose a very specific scenario, right?
Yes. A highly publicized U.S. Iran-Israel BRICS summit held in Delhi, complete with a televised deadline. And I find this point absolutely brilliant because it highlights why theatricality matters so much in geopolitics.
It's a profound observation on the nature of power. The author states that modern leaders, trapped by their own rhetoric and domestic political bases, do not seek peace for the sake of peace.
They seek an exit strategy that can be seamlessly packaged and sold as a total victory to their domestic audiences.
Right. If Trump needs to look historically strong and unparalleled as a negotiator, if Netanyahu needs to look utterly uncompromising on Israeli security, and if Mojtaba Khamenei needs to look defiant and victorious over the Western imperialists, you have to physically build a stage where they can all do that.
You need a highly publicized summit like the one proposed in Delhi, a neutral yet globally significant venue where they can all simultaneously stand at podiums and declare to their people that they forced the others to back down.
The theatricality is the mechanism of de-escalation. Without a stage, the actors just keep performing.
But until that stage is built, until the diplomatic groundwork forces them to the table, the text outlines a very grim, violent trajectory for the immediate future.
The next 2 weeks of this hypothetical war, following day 30, do not show any signs of de-escalation.
No, it is a brutal holding pattern. The U.S. military is going to be bogged down in the incredibly dangerous, slow work of trying to clear acoustic smart mines in the Strait of Hormuz to stop the global economic bleeding.
All while under the threat of coastal missile fire.
Right. Israel will likely shift its primary focus northward to aggressively degrading Hezbollah in Lebanon to secure its immediate borders.
And Iran will just keep doing exactly what is working: proxy warfare, maritime sabotage, and launching just enough missiles to keep the coalition spending millions of dollars on interceptors, keeping the global economy sweating.
It is a holding pattern of immense calculated destruction. When you step back and look at the entirety of this 30-day hypothetical retrospective, the author drives home one brutal, overarching lesson about modern warfare. Air power is a hammer. It is the biggest, most technologically advanced, precise hammer in the history of human conflict. But Iran is not a nail. Iran is a cave system.
And you cannot smash a cave system with a hammer. You only break the rocks around the entrance, while the ecosystem inside continues to thrive and adapt.
The true battleground, the one that really dictates the outcome of the scenario, has fundamentally shifted away from the skies over Tehran. It has shifted to the murky waters of Hormuz and the subterranean rail lines of the Zagros Mountains.
The text proves that in our hyper-interconnected world, a war's impact isn't just measured by the blast radius of a bunker buster or the radar cross-section of a stealth jet.
No. It is ultimately measured by marine insurance premiums, by the supply of liquefied natural gas, and by the cost of bread around the world. The world is watching a global economy held at knife point by a force they cannot see and cannot reach.
And this raises a profound implication, a final tangent for you to consider long after we wrap up this discussion.
Oh, lay it on me.
We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing how a sovereign nation-state uses deep earth engineering to neutralize the greatest air force in history. But tunnel boring technology is increasingly commercialized.
Right, for subways and infrastructure.
It is becoming cheaper and more accessible. If deep earth engineering is the ultimate proven defense against air supremacy, what happens when non-state actors, massive international cartels, rogue paramilitaries, or well-funded insurgencies gain access to commercial tunnel boring machines?
Oh, wow. If they can dig just 50 meters down into bedrock, they become immune to drone strikes.
Exactly. We aren't just looking at the future of state-on-state warfare in this document. We might be looking at the privatization of invulnerability.
The privatization of invulnerability, that is terrifying.
If any sufficiently funded group realizes that burying their operations under a few hundred feet of rock renders multi-million-dollar Western precision munitions completely obsolete, it fundamentally rewrites the rules of global deterrence for the rest of the 21st century. How do you police a world where the worst actors can simply retreat into the crust of the earth?
It's a chilling thought. We started by talking about a multi-trillion-dollar military force rendered powerless by granite. The true terror isn't just that the granite works, it's that anyone with enough money and time can dig into it. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.